Hello, I'm Luke from Luke's English Podcast. Hello. That was a bit strange, wasn't it? Now, I'm recording this video because I wanted to explain the Russian joke again. To be honest, I don't really want to explain it, but I feel like I have to make a video explaining this thing so that every time someone asks me to explain it, I can just show them this video. I don't need to actually ever explain it again. I'll just put it into a video and then it never needs to be repeated again. Okay? So if you listen to my podcast regularly, nice one, hello, then you probably noticed sometimes either I or some of my friends on the podcast refer to this thing called the Russian joke. It's a bit annoying, to be honest, because I always have to explain it. And it came out of a little story that I told in one of the episodes. Now, people always ask me to explain this, so as I said, I'm just going to record this video so that I then never have to explain it again. If anyone asks me to, I'll just be like, watch this! There you go. Now, so I think it was in December 2015 that this was first mentioned on the podcast. And it was mentioned by me and my friend Paul, and we just told the story of an experience that we'd had. We told that story to our friend Amber. So it's me, Paul Taylor, Amber Minogue. We sometimes get together and record episodes of the podcast. So Paul and I were just talking about an experience that we'd had to Amber. And that experience was one in which I told a joke on stage during one of our comedy shows, and no one in the audience laughed, and it was a bit embarrassing for me. And amongst comedians, we sometimes tell each other stories about either how bits of our comedy routine go down well, or bits of the routine don't go down well. And in fact, often it's the embarrassing experiences of when something doesn't work, those often become the stories that we tell each other. So Paul and I were telling Amber a story of this, okay? Now, I perform comedy in Paris in English. So naturally, sometimes people don't understand specific word jokes, and sometimes the response of the audience is to just stare at me like stare at me like an alien who's just landed from another planet or something, just like this kind of either a sort of a stare of like, what on earth is this? Or often it's a sort of an interested look, like they're looking at me like, you know, this is interesting, I'm hearing what you've got to say, even though I don't realise that there are many jokes which are flying over my head. They're still sort of politely, patiently listening to me and missing all of the jokes. So the evening that Paul and I explained to Amber this experience is an example of this. So I'll tell you the story now. So I was on stage. It was a show that I was doing with Paul Taylor, and I was on stage at the beginning of the show. And normally at a comedy show, what you do is you talk to the audience a bit, you ask them questions, you ask them where they come from, you ask them what they do in their job, in order to get some information from the audience and then make jokes based on the information. You sort of pick on members of the audience a bit, or just make some jokes based on things that they've said, and it breaks the ice and it gets the audience laughing, and it sort of basically sets up the right sort of atmosphere in the room for the show to go correctly. All right, so I was doing this at the beginning of our show. I'd been talking to the audience for about 10 minutes. Where are you from? What do you do? Etc, etc. And then after about 10 minutes, a few people arrived late, and I immediately engaged them in conversation, and I immediately said to them, hey, you guys are a bit late. Come in, sit down. Where are you from? So I started to engage them in conversation. Where are you from? I said. And they turned to me as they were sitting down and said, oh, we're Russian. Now, immediately I thought of a joke, because that's your job, isn't it? On stage, you have to try and make jokes based on what people have said. So I immediately thought of a joke, and it's basically a joke on the word Russian, because Russian, obviously the nationality, someone from Russia, Russian sounds a bit like another word in English, doesn't it? It sounds a bit like the word rushing. Russian, rushing. And that's it, really. To be honest, I could just stop the whole video right here, because that's it. There's not really any need to go any further. But that's the joke, okay? Russian, rushing, that's it, Okay, so it's not any more clever or more sophisticated than that. It's very simple and it's not particularly brilliant. But, so they said, I said, you're late, where are you from? They said, we're from Russia. And then I said, immediately, I said, well, you obviously weren't rushing to get here, were you? Because you're late. And the response was nothing. No response from the audience. The two Russian people continued to sit down and get themselves comfortable. Everyone else in the audience just carried on looking at me. Like, okay, these are words. When's the comedy going to start? You know, that's kind of what happened. Now, admittedly, it wasn't a very good joke. But also, I could just tell the people in the room who didn't have English as a first language hadn't noticed that I'd just made a joke. Now, while it's not the best joke in the world, I, at the time, was quite pleased with it. I was quite proud that I'd come up with this off the top of my head. And so I thought, well, they've just missed it. All I need to do is just sort of repeat it or just show them that they've just missed this joke. And A, they might find the original joke funny if they notice it. And B, just the act of explaining that they'd missed it, just highlighting the kind of, you know, the language gap, and just highlighting the situation that I'd found myself in, that I'd made a joke and they hadn't noticed. Highlighting that and then explaining the joke might be funny too, because I just find that sort of thing amusing. And I thought it might be sort of postmodern and self-referential and ironic to explain a joke that I'd just done that they'd missed. So then I sort of adopted this ironic attitude, and I was like, I think you'll find that you just missed a rather clever joke that I just made. They just came in and they said, and they were late, and I said, where are you from? And they said, we're Russian. And I said, well, you obviously weren't rushing to get here, were you? Because you're late. Again, total silence from the room, no joke, no laughs, and in fact no evidence that they'd identified that a joke had been made. That was the key thing. It's not like the room was like, ugh, or, you know, it wasn't like that. They just you know, sat there and listened to me because they didn't realise a joke had been made. So I, at that moment, felt crushed, and I felt alone in the universe. Like I just stood there realising there's a huge gap between me and the audience because they hadn't understood this joke the first time, and then they hadn't understood it the second time either, and immediately it was like I was alone in the universe. So anyway, I just carried on. My friend Paul was sitting at the back of the room just falling off his chair. He couldn't control himself. He was just in stitches. He couldn't stop laughing to watch me in this situation where I'm trying to explain myself and I'm just making it worse and worse, because that's the sort of thing that happens to me all the time, and that they didn't understand, and I'm making a joke and I'm explaining it and they still don't understand, and they don't even realise that something has happened. And so Paul is at the back of the room just falling off his chair laughing while I'm struggling on stage. So that's the story that Paul and I told to Amber. The story of me telling a joke about the word Russian and no one understanding it, and me feeling sort of destroyed by it. Okay, so we told that story to Amber on the podcast in December. And ironically enough, in the comments section under that episode were some people saying, I don't understand the Russian joke. What, can you explain it? And then, you know, upon reading it, I was like, oh, I think I did. I just did explain it. I just explained it, didn't I? I explained it maybe 3 times. It's coming back to get me. So now, every time this is mentioned in the podcast, someone writes a comment asking me to explain it. So, okay, back in December, first time I mentioned it, a comment saying, can you explain the Russian joke? So next time I was with Paul and Amber, I mentioned the comment and I explained it again. And of course, then someone wrote a comment under that episode saying, I didn't understand that Russian joke. Could you explain that for me? And then I explained it again, and someone then wrote another comment saying, I heard you told a Russian joke and there was no explanation for it. How are we expected to understand this? And so every time now someone asks me to explain the Russian joke, I feel like I'm going to go crazy, because it's like an impossible situation where I explain the joke and someone else doesn't get it, and they ask me to explain it and I explain it again, someone else doesn't get it. I'm just going round and round and round and round in circles. Also, Paul Taylor and Amber, now they love this situation. They think this is hilarious, that I'm stuck in this horrible circle where I'm constantly explaining a terrible joke and then having to explain it again, and it's going around and around. They love this. So every time that they come onto my podcast now, they have decided that they're going to somehow mention the Russian joke. So it's like a running thing. Every time they're on the podcast, it's particularly Paul, they try and get the Russian joke in there somewhere just to make me embarrassed, and so that someone will write a comment. And it's now September, so it's nearly a year after the joke was first mentioned. It's now September, and I had Paul and Amber on the podcast just a couple of weeks ago, and naturally Paul told the Russian joke. I think we were talking about places that Amber had been to. So it's like, Amber, have you been? You've been to Asia, you've been to America, you've been to South America, you've been to all these European countries. I said to her, have you been to Russia? And she said, no, I haven't been to Russia. Paul jumped in and said, you obviously weren't rushing to go there, were you? And we all laughed, and it was like, oh, really, Paul, you did it again. I bet someone's going to comment on that. Naturally, someone did comment, and I got a comment under that saying, I didn't understand that Russian joke. Could someone explain it for me? Ah!